On average, every day across the globe, 150,000 people die, and more than 100,000 of them die from aging.
I describe aging in the book as the world's greatest humanitarian challenge, and I really do believe that to be the case. The huge majority of human suffering is caused by aging.
But science writer Andrew Steele believes it does not have to be that way.
I really see research into aging as just a natural extension of the goals of modern medicine. We're trying to make people live healthier for longer.
In Ageless, the new science of getting older without getting old, Steele offers a new way to think about aging, not as an immutable fact of nature, but rather as the underlying cause of most fatal diseases. Arrest the aging process, the theory goes, and cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease could all become preventable.
There's not going to be a single pill you take that makes you live forever. I think that's what people imagine when you talk about a cure for aging, as I sometimes do. What it's going to be is it's going to be a whole variety of different treatments, different medicines, perhaps stem cells, perhaps gene therapy, all coming together to defer all of these different diseases in a variety of different ways.
But what about the implications of extending life, possibly by decades, on an already troubled planet?
The ethics is simpler than people make it out to be. I think people imagine sort of these mad sci-fi scenarios where there are sort of dystopias with billionaires living forever, or there are millions and millions of bored people clogging up the planet into the indefinite future. But actually, if the science just adds a few years of healthy life to everyone's life expectancy and slowly does this, it's just going to be a continuation of a process that's been going on for hundreds of years already.
Andrew Steele, thanks very much for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So just before we get started, we want to let folks know that your book, Ageless, is available locally at Left Bank Books in the Central West End. So check it out. So let's check you out for a minute first before we get into the book. You are a computational biologist. What is that?
Yeah, people often say that, and actually the clue is in the name. I used to use computers to analyse the huge amounts of biological data that are being produced these days. So if you think about things like genomic sequencing, so that's sequencing the DNA letters that make up your genetic code, or it's looking at the medical records of patients is the other thing that I was involved with. So looking at all the different things. In the UK, we're very lucky to have the NHS, this National Health Service, so we could join up people's medical records, we could take their records from their GP, the things that they happen to them in hospital, combine all of them together and try and work out stuff about those people. And basically, there's a really ongoing theme in biology over the last few decades that there's just more and more data. So what we really need is the sort of programmers, people like me, to try and analyse and understand that data.
As I was reading the book, I kept thinking of something my dad used to say all the time, which was, the longer you live, the longer you will live. And that never made any sense to me at all until I read your book. But there's actually some truth to that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even if we just take regular, current normal life expectancy statistics, the longer you live, exactly as you say, your life expectancy at that age continues to increase because effectively you've made it that far. You've dodged whatever bullets there were in your early life, for example. So, if you don't get an infection and die as a kid, then obviously you're going to potentially live to a higher expected life overall. But what's really exciting about living in the present day is that advances in medicine are just so rapid that you can benefit from medicines that weren't even on the drawing board when you were a kid. And the sort of everyday example of that is, imagine you were born in the 30s or the 40s. You were born into a world where, economic growth was driving improvements in nutrition, vaccines and antibiotics were just starting to come onto the scene, so infections were getting less and less prevalent. And what that might mean is that you were lucky enough to survive into your 60s and 70s. And so if you were entering sort of older age in the 90s or early 2000s, there were just treatments for heart disease, treatments for cancer that were nowhere near being imagined, back at the time when you were born. And they could potentially save your life and allow you to live another 5 or 10 years longer at that end as well. And with the advent of real anti-aging medicine that can slow down or even reverse the aging process, obviously the topic of my book, then, the hope is that could just continue because, I'm in my 30s now. I'm very much hoping that by the time I'm in my 60s or 70s, some of these treatments that I talk about will have come to fruition. And I mean, that's even true if you're already in your 60s or 70s. I think some of these things are going to be on the drawing board, now, and therefore in the next 5 to 10 years, we could be seeing the first drugs that can slow or reverse aging. And so exactly like your dad said, the longer you can live, the more chance you have to benefit from these breakthroughs in science and medicine, and the longer you can go on to live overall.
You established early on in the book that aging is the leading cause of death. And when I read that at first, I thought, well, duh. But I thought, well, wait a minute. Aging is like a disease?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I often show this graph in talks that I give. And in fact, it's a graph that basically changed my career. And it's the graph of how likely you are compared to how old you are. And, on the one hand, it's blindingly obvious. Older people are more likely to die. All of us knew that. But I think what's really striking is, firstly, just how much more likely to die they are. Someone in their 90s has a 1 in 6 chance of not making their next birthday, whereas someone who's a young adult could have a chance of less than 1 in 1,000 of, not making it through that year. So there's this really striking increase. But also, I think what you've got to understand is that although there's this sort of myth that you can die of old age, you can get some sort of painless death in your sleep that ultimately won't be that painful, that horrible for you. Actually, what happens is that aging causes all of the horrible diseases that we think about in late life. Things like cancer, things like heart disease are essentially caused by the aging process. And that means that once you've understood that that's the sort of biological reason that these things happen, then, you can start looking at aging. I'm not necessarily very, very eager to call it a disease because it's sort of qualitatively different from diseases, but it's certainly something that causes diseases and brings about a lot of suffering. And once you understand that we've got the biological tools, the science, to treat the aging process itself, and then potentially defer all of these things that I'm very happy to call diseases, things like cancer and dementia and so on, then to me it's just a no-brainer.
A lot of the research done on things like this is done on mice, but on the cover of the book you've got a picture of, I guess that's the Galapagos tortoise. What can we learn from the Galapagos tortoise?
So that one actually isn't a Galapagos tortoise, but what we can learn from Galapagos tortoises and other tortoises, turtles, all kinds of different sort of members of that family, and in fact other creatures as well, is that, so I said before that there's this massive increase in the chance of death as you get older as a human being. Your risk of death doubles about every 7 or 8 years. So it starts out very small in youth, but it grows exponentially. And I mean, we've all had a crash course in the last 12 months or so of the power of exponential growth. It means your odds of death in late life are very, very high indeed. What's amazing about Galapagos tortoises, about other kinds of tortoise, about certain kinds of fish, certain kinds of salamander, and a few other weirder creatures, is that they have a chance of death that doesn't vary depending on how long ago they were born. So a Galapagos tortoise, the first example I give in my book is this creature called Harriet. She was picked up, we think, by Charles Darwin on the Galapagos Islands when he was out doing the research that would later go on to inform his theory of evolution by natural selection. And he picked up this tortoise, and she went on to outlive Darwin by over a century. She lived to the age of, we think, about 177. It's quite hard to know exactly how old she was. But nonetheless, her chance of death didn't vary depending on how old she was. So we think a tortoise's chance of death is somewhere in the region of 1 or 2% a year, but it just stays the same. And it's not just that their chance of death stays the same. This negligible senescence also means they're not becoming frail, they're not losing their mental faculties, they're staying reproductively active even until very late in life. And so they're basically, retaining that youthful vitality until they just keel over at the end. And what this shows us is that aging isn't an immutable law of biology. And so hopefully, humans can start to take a few steps toward being more negligibly senescent, a bit more Galapagos tortoise ourselves.
You just used the word senescence, and I know one of the things that you talk about a great deal in the book are senescent cells. What are they, and how do they apply to this unlocking this mystery of aging and maybe stopping it or slowing it?
So senescent, as you'll have gathered from its occurrence in both those places, is just the sort of biological term for old or aging. And a senescent cell is a cell that isn't dividing anymore. So it's perhaps divided too many times. It's got dangerous damage to its DNA that might indicate it could be on the course to becoming cancerous, or it can just be a cell that's in a stressed out environment. And whatever the case, most of your cells are dividing away, replenishing tissues and that sort of thing inside your body. But a senescent cell puts on the brakes. It realizes there's something wrong. And these cells accumulate in our bodies as we get older. And it's not just this accumulation of sort of benign, non-dividing elders of the cellular community. Unfortunately, they pump out this sort of cocktail of toxic molecules whose purpose is to attract the immune system and say, I'm senescent, I'm over here, I'm not doing my job properly, can you come and gobble me up? And hopefully some passing immune cell, just as it will gobble up an invading virus or bacterium, can instead gobble up this senescent cell and get rid of the problem. The problem is, as we age, we get more and more of these cells, our immune system gets less and less good at finding them and rooting them out and getting rid of them. And that means that they accumulate. And we think that they're behind this whole swathe of age-related diseases, cancer, heart disease, all kinds of different stuff. And what's most exciting about this is we've actually got medicines that we can use to clear senescent cells. So the first experiments were done in mice, obviously, and what they found was that by removing these senescent cells, you could give them to a 24-month-old mouse. Now, mice age quite a lot quicker than us, so that's equivalent to maybe 70 in human years. And that would give the mice that had been given the drug a couple of extra months of life compared to a mouse that hadn't been given it. So, so far, so good. But again, it wasn't extending that period of frailty. It was basically making the mice biologically younger. It would, by getting rid of their senescent cells, reduce their rate of cancer, reduce their rate of heart disease. They got fewer cataracts. They could run further and faster on a little mousy treadmill. They even had better fur. These animals just look great. And so what this suggests is that these senescent cells are an underlying cause. In the book, I talk about hallmarks of the aging process. And the idea is that these are the fundamental drivers, the underpinnings of all this variety of different things that happen to us as we get older. And that by taking a drug to get rid of our own senescent cells, maybe we could have this wide-ranging set of benefits too. And what's really, really exciting is that these are already in human trials. So they're not in trials yet for just the aging process. They're currently looking at specific diseases where senescent cells are known to be a problem. But if they're safe, if they're effective, if they don't have huge numbers of side effects, then what we can hope is that rather than taking it for your knee arthritis or for age-related macular degeneration, the kinds of things they're currently in trials for, then hopefully you'll be able to just pop a pill in your 50s, not because you're quote unquote ill, but because you were born a long time ago. You're starting to accumulate these senescent cells, and hopefully that can defer these frailty, the illness of late life, a few years into the future.
How much research is being done in this area, and is there a donor constituency for aging research? The Cancer Society and the Alzheimer's Society, and are very well funded in a lot of ways. Are people interested in donating to this research, and how much of it is actually going on?
It's a real challenge. I think the problem is that there isn't this public recognition of aging. Like you say, at first it sounds obvious, but then until you realise there is this scientific potential, it can sound quite strange. I think, when you think of what your relatives have died of, and that, whether you're a politician assigning funding money that way, or whether you're a private donor trying to think of a charity to give to, you might think about your grandma who died of cancer or your father who died of a stroke and give money to those particular charities. Very few of us actually think of our aged relatives of having died of aging, even though that is ultimately, as I say, sort of what the biological cause is of that happening. And that means there isn't a great deal of aging research. There aren't huge charities. So in the UK, where I live, the Cancer Research UK is the single largest charity, and yet Age UK is much, much smaller, and it doesn't really do a great deal of research. There's a lot more sort of supporting people in in their homes and that kind of stuff. And also the kinds of research they do tends to be sort of social gerontology, we call it. So trying to improve people's ability to socialise, trying to improve their living environment, not so much dealing with the sort of biogerontology I talk about in the book. So to give an example of the funding in the US, the National Institutes for Aging, which is the US's funding body that is devoted to researching aging, gets something like $3.5 billion a year, which might sound like a lot of money, but then you can compare it to the $4 trillion that is spent in the US every year on healthcare. So it's less than 1,000th of that before you even start. And actually, when you drill down into it, the NIA also suffers from this problem that there's a lot of research going into age-related diseases rather than aging itself. So if you drill down, there's a joke in the biogerontology community that NIA actually stands for National Institute on Alzheimer's Disease rather than aging. The reason being that the neuroscience division of that organisation gets the vast majority of its funding. About 2 of the $3.5 billion goes straight to basically Alzheimer's disease. And then when you look at the division of aging biology, the one that's really concerned with understanding, picking apart the aging process that gives rise to that dementia and also gives rise to cancer and heart disease and so on, it's about $350 million a year, which is just, about $1 per American or something like that, which is just incredible considering it makes up this enormous quantity of healthcare spending. Even from a purely economic point of view, it would be incredibly worthwhile to try and reduce the amount of money that's spent on healthcare, reduce the amount of money that it costs the economy more widely because people give up work because they get ill, because they give up work to look after elderly relatives. Probably cost the US trillions of dollars a year, and yet putting an absolute pittance into researching it by comparison to other diseases.
Do you think part of the problem is the understanding, or maybe the misunderstanding, that if you cure aging or improve longevity, but you don't do anything that combats those diseases, that people will just live longer but be sicker?
I think so, and I think it's as I say, when you said it sounds obvious, but then when you dig deeper, it isn't as obvious as you initially thought. I think that's the problem, because everyone understands aging. We've got a lifetime to sort of come to terms with what it means to grow old, and so there are lots of different misconceptions. One of them is exactly what you say. People think that the idea of treating aging, somehow you'll keep this sort of frail, cognitively declining body and mind alive for decades and decades longer than its sell-by date. And you'll spend your first 80 years slowly declining, then you spend your last 40 years, you'll live to 120, but you'll be in a nursing home for those last few decades. And that just isn't the case, because to put it simply, the things that kill you are diseases. It's being ill, and so it's incredibly difficult to keep a frail person who's susceptible to illness alive for those decades and decades of time. The way that this is going to work is essentially making people biologically younger. It's going to be turning back the clock in a whole swathe of different ways, and so that's not something to worry about in my opinion. But the problem as you say, is that there are these misconceptions. When people think about aging research, they put it in a really different moral, philosophical, ethical category. And, you just get all kinds of things bubbling up that you wouldn't get. If I'd written a book about cancer, cancer research, cancer treatment, then I just get questions that I wouldn't get if I'd done that because I've written a book on aging.
You get a lot of pushback.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, the most common question, back when you could go to dinner parties and weddings, we're currently still locked down here in the UK and have been for some time. But back in those days, the first thing people would say when I said I was working on a book on aging is, what about overpopulation? Where are we going to put all the people? And just imagine I'd written a book on malaria or cancer or heart disease. Then, that isn't the first thing that would spring to mind. They'd ask, what can I do to improve my lifestyle? Or, how are these medicines going to work and when they're going to be available? But no, almost everybody jumps straight to the overpopulation question, which is just remarkable to me because I really see research into aging as just a natural extension of the goals of modern medicine. We're trying to make people live healthier for longer. And, this is just one way that's going to be particularly effective because we can treat multiple diseases at the same time. We can prevent, we can defer these diseases. So it is the absolute, in my opinion, the epitome, the pinnacle of what we could hope to achieve with modern medicine. And yet people put it in this wildly separate category. And that comes with a whole load of sort of ethical and social baggage.
You point out that if, you put all of the population of the world in one spot, it wouldn't take up very much room.
Yeah, I think there's I tried to do a calculation on this when I was writing the book, and it works out that if you squeezed every single human as close together as possible, you could fit them all into Houston, which I believe is nicknamed Space City, so that was quite ironic. And I think if we spread them out a little bit more into a city with a sort of average Western city's population density, the whole of the world would fit into an area the size of Texas. So this isn't it's big, but it's not vast. It's not like smothering the entire Earth. We've got plenty of room. The real thing that drives our use of land is food, basically, and a huge fraction of that is eating meat. So if we all just cut back our meat intake by a little bit, we could dramatically increase the number of people that we could squeeze onto the planet.
Is the science running ahead of the ethics discussion in all this?
I don't feel that it is, no, because I think the ethics is simpler than people make it out to be. I think people imagine sort of these mad sci-fi scenarios where there are sort of dystopias with billionaires living forever, or, there are millions and millions of bored people clogging up the planet into the indefinite future. But actually, if the science just adds a few years of healthy life to everyone's life expectancy and slowly does this and means, as we started the interview with, the longer you live, the longer you go on to live, it's just going to be a continuation of a process that's been going on for hundreds of years already. Like if you look back at global life expectancy since the middle of the 19th century, then it's been the top performing country in the world has been improving, and it obviously varies which country that is by year, but that improvement has been 3 months per year every year, like clockwork. It's astounding how straight that line is. And so extrapolating that out into the future, we can already expect to live longer lives if medicine and sort of public health and all the changes that are currently going on just continue. Whereas, all that treating aging is going to do is it's going to make that increase a bit faster. It's something that, I think has been a massive force for social good. I'm fantastically glad that I can live this huge, long, healthy life. Back in the 1850s or something, I'd be approaching statistically dead. Life expectancy was probably in the sort of 30 to 40 years old region. Whereas now I can look forward to as much life again. And that's remarkable. And I think surely that has been a change for the better. And to continue that, I think would be a change for the better as well. Aging is the single largest cause of suffering and death around the world. About 70% of deaths around the world, and that's the whole world, not just the rich world, are caused essentially by aging. That number is increasing because obviously populations in developing countries are aging as well, in fact even faster than we have in the West. And then what that means is that people are suffering for decades before that death. When you die of aging, you get more frail, you lose your you can lose your mind, you can lose your independence in all kinds of ways, before we even talk about the horrible things diseases can do to you. So if you were to be able to eradicate all of that suffering, but the cost would be we had to work less than 1% a year harder to solve issues around the environment, I'd happily make that trade-off. And I think if you sort of laid it out to people in that way, then I think most other people would do that as well. It's just that, like I say, we've got this strange sort of cognitive bias that puts aging in this completely separate moral category. If I were to, as I said, if we were talking about cancer research, there's no way any journalist would ask me, what are we going to do with all these people who live an extra couple of years thanks to this cancer treatment that saves their life? Won't they get bored? What are they going to do with all the extra people? And yet, when you're talking about aging, those are exactly the first questions you get.
You talk in the book about things that we can do to live longer. A whole list of things, one of them being a woman, but obviously that's not exactly
not so good for you and me.
But I'm wondering, how much time do any of these things, exercise, eating, so forth, actually add to our lives? Right now, there's the old quip about quitting smoking that, you don't live longer, it just feels longer. Well,
Yeah.
all of these things combined, are we really buying that much more time if we live these great, healthy lives?
I mean, quitting smoking is an absolute no-brainer. That is my top bit of health advice. It's like, if you want to live a long, healthy life, then quitting smoking should be the first item on your list. And the reason is you live about 10 years longer, and it's not just that it feels like longer, you live 10 healthy years longer as well. So you live, an extra decade on the end of your life, and an extra decade in good health. So smokers can't even claim to live fast and die young. What happens is they just come down with age. It effectively accelerates the aging process, frankly. Although obviously the lungs bear the brunt of the damage from smoking, it has various effects that end up spreading throughout the body. You even see smokers getting wrinkles and grey hair and hair loss sooner than non-smokers. So it's this really global acceleration of the aging process that they're living and experiencing. And actually what you find is the same thing with loads of other health advice. So things like eating well, not being overweight, trying to get some exercise. These slow down the aging process too, or pretty much. And I think actually being overweight is a really good example. If you're carrying extra fat, that fat can give out inflammatory molecules, and it can drive a process called chronic inflammation. And that's known to drive all kinds of different age-related diseases, heart disease, stroke, cancer, all of these things, or not all cancers, I should say, some cancers. But nonetheless, it drives this whole sort of swathe of age-related changes. And by losing a bit of weight, you can reduce that inflammatory burden on your body and basically slow down your aging. So I think that it's actually made health advice a lot more compelling to me, because you hear this stuff all the time, don't you? Make sure you get half an hour's exercise a day, make sure you eat a variety of good things, and don't be too overweight. But when you understand the biology behind them, and that's what I try to explain in the book, it just really, it's really made me want to go out for a run a little bit more often than I did before.
Is there a point, though, of no return or diminishing returns? Say somebody is 60 years old, overweight, spends all day interviewing people via Skype. I'm asking for a friend, you understand. Is it too late, or can you always try to reverse the aging process?
You always can, and I think this is really remarkable. I found some great studies where they had given 90-somethings an exercise resistance training program, so strength training basically, and they found that even people at that age after a period of, I think it was a month or two, they could walk further, they could walk faster, they had improved grip strength, which is commonly used as a measurement of aging. So you really can, it's never too late to start. And the fact is that all of these aging processes are cumulative. So if you think about cancer, it's driven by accumulation of damage to your DNA, like mutations in your genetic code. So if you don't get that final mutation, then the cancer might never appear. And that means that, it doesn't matter if you've accumulated 9 of the 10 mutations the cancer needs already. If you can just, be good, be healthy for, starting now, then potentially you avoid that final mutation and you avoid getting cancer. So I just feel like it's a really important message. It doesn't matter how late you start. And actually the most, when you're talking about diminishing returns, what I thought you were going to say is, can you do too much exercise? And that's the sort of much more optimistic flip side of this, is if you are very sedentary, very unhealthy, very overweight, or even old, it's the people who are in the worst health who benefit the most from the first smallest bits of exercise. And actually, if you're a marathon runner and you're already running an hour a day to train, then there's probably not a lot of benefit to upping that to 90 minutes. Whereas if you're someone who doesn't get out of the house very much, even just a 10-minute walk a day can radically improve your health. So I just say, really get on it. It's massively worth it. And not only that, as we were saying right at the top of this, the longer you can live in good health, if you can get out for a walk, if you can eat a bit better, and so on, then that gives you more and more time to be alive in time for these developments in medicine, which just are so exciting, and they're so nearly on the horizon. That's definitely got me out jogging, basically.
Yes, I'll tell my friend to go out and buy a treadmill for his birthday. This will sound like I'm trying to give you an argument. I'm not, but I'm wondering if people raise this question that, there are so many problems in the world right now. Why focus on extending life and just all of us having to live with those problems longer, as opposed to channeling our energy into making the life we have naturally better?
I think that I describe aging in the book as the world's greatest humanitarian challenge. And I really do believe that to be the case. The huge majority of human suffering is caused by aging. And that sounds counterintuitive because, like I say, we all internalize this as just a natural part of being alive and a process that we've got so long to come to terms with happening to us. But the fact is that being ill, being unwell, losing your independence, becoming more frail, these are all awful things. And your friends are dying around you, you're losing your social contact, you're unable to get out and hang out with the friends that are left or your family. It's just this incredible source, given that it's responsible for 70% of deaths. I think it's very hard to make an argument that anything else comes close in terms of importance. That's not to say we shouldn't be dealing with other stuff. I'm a passionate advocate for things like action on climate change. We need to do something about global poverty. There are all kinds of things that we need to get higher on the radar. The fact is, I just think you can do both. Given that we're currently, or in the US, it's currently $350 million a year going into public research on aging. You could radically increase that budget without in any way impacting on efforts to solve other problems in the world. And, if I was looking for a low-hanging fruit, something really wasteful and pointless that, I'd want to try and cut the budget off to try and increase the budget of some of these other incredibly worthy causes, aging biology just isn't that thing.
Where would you put that money if you had some to put? I mean, gene therapy or stem cell research? We talked about senescent cells, obviously. Where do you think you'd get the most bang for your buck?
I actually think all of the above, but it would depend a bit on where they were in their R&D. So in the book, I break the causes of aging down into these 10 hallmarks. And the 10 hallmarks, firstly, they're the sort of fundamental biological underpinnings, and that's one reason to select them. The second reason is that they've got quite distinct ways in which you should treat them. And so senescent cells, probably the most promising thing at the moment, is these senolytic drugs, as I said, where you get rid of the senescent cells because they're accumulating, you remove them, hopefully that will solve the problem. And that's something that's really, really sort of in the near term going to be available in the clinic. There are other things like trying to deal with the damage that accumulates in our DNA as we get older. That these aren't hundreds of years away, but they're ideas that are on the drawing board rather than ready to be implemented in hospitals. They're just a clinical trial away from success. So what I would do is I'd invest in a portfolio approach because I think that the treatments to aging, it's not going to be that we solve senescent cells and that causes all the other dominoes to fall. I feel like, as I say, there are 10 of these hallmarks. We might not have to hit all 10 of them because they're interrelated in quite complicated ways, and it might be that hitting this one helps these two a little bit, then hitting this one helps those a little bit as well, and it sort of all intermingles in that way. But ultimately, at this point, I don't think we know enough about the process to know which are the key hallmarks. So I just put a decent chunk of money into each of those at different stages of the research and the development and see what comes out. And ultimately, probably, there's not going to be a single pill you take that makes you live forever. I think that's what people imagine when you talk about a cure for aging, as I sometimes do. What it's going to be is it's going to be a whole variety of different treatments, different medicines, perhaps stem cells, perhaps gene therapy, all coming together to defer all of these different diseases in a variety of different ways. So it's, there's no silver bullet, basically, but I think all of this stuff is exciting enough and we've got ideas that it's definitely worth sinking some money into.
You researched this book for about 2 years. The footnotes in the back are extensive. It could take you as long to read the footnotes as it does the book if one were so inclined. But I'm wondering, there must have been an awful lot that you couldn't get in there. Is there one or two things in particular you wish you would have had room for?
It's tricky. I think the things that I didn't include tended to be things that were not quite as obvious what the mechanism was. And one that I thought was quite exciting that I've read about was the a treatment called deuteration of fatty acids, which sounds very, very technical. So deuterium is a heavy version of hydrogen. It's exactly the same chemistry, but rather than having a single proton in the middle of the hydrogen atom, it's got a proton and a neutron. And what some researchers have found is that by swapping out the hydrogens for deuterium in various places in the cell, it seems to be able to make those places in the cell more robust. And it's really fascinating, but you just got no idea. I couldn't quite work out how that slotted into the other hallmarks. And I just think there are it's sometimes worth just funding these left field ideas where you're not quite sure how they work or how it fits into everything. But nonetheless, could potentially make our bodies more robust to the ravages of time.
Ageless is the book. It's available now at Left Bank Books here in St. Louis. This could have been a very depressing topic, but it's fascinating, and thanks to your sort of breezy style, it was actually very, very entertaining to read. Andrew Steele, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and thanks for saying such nice things about the book as well.
You, me, and the sun. It's a beautiful new day. Let's have crazy fun. It's a beautiful new day. Singing whoa oh oh whoa oh oh. It's a beautiful new day. Whoa oh oh whoa oh oh. It's a beautiful new day. It's a beautiful